Daniel Ward and Lewis Carter lived a life most people only dream of: luxury cars, private jets, and millions in cash. But behind their glamorous facade, they were building one of the UK's most dangerous drug empires, a kingdom that would collapse in spectacular fashion. In the heart of Manchester's rougher streets, two childhood friends, Daniel Ward and Lewis Carter, grew up surrounded by poverty, broken families, and the constant hum of survival. From a young age, they dreamed of escaping the grey tower blocks and making a name for themselves. They didn't want ordinary lives. They wanted fast cars, luxury homes, and the kind of respect that money could buy. Their first venture was small but clever, selling fake designer clothes and watches at local markets. They learned how to convince people, how to move quietly, and how to stay one step ahead of the police. Their charm and street-smart attitude made them popular among local traders, and before long, they were making more money than anyone their age had a right to. But Daniel and Lewis were not satisfied. The money was good, yet it wasn't enough to match their ambition. They began paying attention to the city's real players, men who ran illegal betting dens, loan sharks, and drug traffickers who controlled entire neighborhoods. These figures drove expensive cars and wore diamond watches. The two friends started to realize that if they wanted true power, they would have to step into the world of organized crime. It was dangerous, but to them it was the fastest route to everything they had ever wanted. Their first step into the drug trade was almost accidental. A contact from their counterfeit clothing business offered them a chance to distribute small quantities of cocaine to partygoers in Manchester's nightlife scene. At first, it seemed like just another hustle, but when the profits started pouring in, they saw the potential. Within months, they expanded beyond clubs and small-time deals. They began building connections with suppliers who could move larger quantities, and soon, Daniel and Lewis were running operations worth tens of thousands of pounds a week. They learned quickly how to avoid police attention, how to manage distribution, and how to keep people loyal through fear and reward. They recruited trusted friends from their neighborhood, creating a network that moved drugs efficiently and quietly. To outsiders, they appeared like successful young businessmen. They invested their profits into luxury cars, properties, and high-end clothing. Their social media pages displayed champagne bottles, private parties, and expensive holidays. People began to whisper about the two young men who had risen from nothing to build an empire. As their reputation spread, Daniel became known as the planner, calm, intelligent, and ruthless when needed. Lewis was the face of the operation, charismatic and bold, loved by everyone who met him. Together they balanced each other perfectly, turning small risks into massive rewards. They started laundering their growing income through car dealerships and nightclub investments, making their empire appear legitimate. By their late 20s, the pair had moved from the back streets of Manchester into a world of mansions, designer suits, and million-pound bank accounts. They felt untouchable, but beneath the glamour, there was a quiet danger forming. The police had begun to take notice of their rapid rise, and enemies within the criminal world were starting to envy their success. For Daniel and Lewis, the path from poverty to luxury was complete, but the road ahead was far more dangerous than they could ever imagine. Daniel and Lewis had built their foundation through determination and street knowledge, but once their small operation started generating serious money, they knew they needed to expand beyond Manchester. The drug trade offered limitless profits, but only for those bold enough to think bigger. They began reaching out to contacts in Liverpool, a city with a long history of smuggling and international trade. It was there that they met men who could get them access to the ports, the very heart of the UK's import system. What began as a few small shipments, hidden in crates of fruit, soon evolved into an organized and well-protected network. The friends registered fake companies, posing as importers of exotic produce, seafood, textiles. Everything looked legitimate on paper, but the real cargo was buried deep inside containers, high-grade cocaine worth millions. They spent months perfecting the system. Shipments arrived from South America disguised as tropical exports, and customs officials, already bribed by middlemen, allowed them to pass through without inspection. Daniel was meticulous about every detail, creating multiple layers of separation between himself and the drugs. Lewis, meanwhile, managed the street operations, ensuring the product reached dealers in London, Birmingham, and Glasgow. Their operation expanded faster than anyone anticipated. Within 2 years, they controlled one of the largest independent drug networks in the country. The profits were staggering. With wealth came luxury. The pair bought mansions in Cheshire, supercars, and even a private jet under the name of one of their shell companies. Their taste for excess grew alongside their empire. Expensive watches, custom suits, and first-class holidays became their new normal. They mingled with celebrities in exclusive clubs, spending thousands in a single night without blinking. To the public, they looked like successful entrepreneurs. Few could imagine that their money came from the country's darkest underworld. But expansion brought new challenges. Managing a network this large meant trusting more people, and trust was a fragile thing in their world. They had to deal with violent gangs, unreliable couriers, and corrupt officials who demanded higher payments. Every shipment carried risk, and one small mistake could bring everything crashing down. Daniel's cautious nature began to clash with Lewis's bold confidence. While Daniel preferred to stay quiet and invisible, Lewis enjoyed showing off their success. He started posting photos online, new cars, expensive watches, and champagne-fueled parties. These images caught the attention of more than just jealous rivals. The National Crime Agency had been monitoring social media for months, using online behavior to track potential money laundering operations. Lewis's posts became a trail of evidence without him realizing it. Despite subtle warnings from their closest associates, the partners ignored the danger. Their confidence had turned into arrogance. They believed their operation was too big, too sophisticated to be caught. Each successful shipment reinforced that illusion, but behind the scenes investigators were quietly building a case, tracing their companies, monitoring bank transfers, and mapping out their network. Daniel and Lewis were at the peak of their empire, enjoying untouchable luxury, unaware that every move they made was leading them closer to their downfall. The empire Daniel and Lewis built seemed unshakable, but every successful criminal network eventually shows cracks, and theirs began to appear quietly, almost unnoticed. The first sign came from within their own ranks. As their operation grew, so did the number of people involved. Drivers, couriers, accountants, and street-level distributors. Each link in the chain increased the risk. Greed and jealousy started to spread among the lower ranks, and whispers of dissatisfaction began to circulate. Some wanted more money, others feared that the authorities were getting too close. Daniel tried to keep order through discipline and fear, but Lewis dismissed the growing unrest as meaningless talk. He believed that loyalty could be bought, and for a while he was right. Then came a serious mistake. A shipment intended for Birmingham was intercepted when one of their drivers, desperate to earn extra cash, sold a small portion of the product on the side. The buyer turned out to be an undercover officer. The arrest that followed was swift and brutal. The driver refused to speak, staying loyal out of fear, but his phone contained encrypted messages and notes that hinted at a larger operation. Investigators couldn't yet identify who was behind it, but they now knew a massive network existed. The National Crime Agency quietly intensified its efforts. Surveillance teams were assigned to follow money trails, property records, and luxury purchases linked to suspicious shell companies. Daniel's investment in car dealerships and Lewis's nightlife ventures began to draw attention. The accounts didn't match the declared income, and certain transactions were traced back to offshore accounts in Cyprus and Dubai. What looked legitimate on the surface began to appear suspicious under closer inspection. Meanwhile, tension between the two leaders began to grow. Daniel wanted to slow things down, restructure, and clean the money properly before expanding further. Lewis, always hungry for more, wanted to push forward with new contacts in Spain and the Netherlands. Their arguments became frequent. Daniel feared they were too visible. Lewis believed fear was weakness. This conflict quietly split their organization into two factions, those loyal to Daniel's cautious leadership, and those drawn to Lewis's aggressive ambition. Adding to their troubles, a rival group from Liverpool began targeting their shipments. 2 warehouses were broken into, and several deliveries went missing. Rumors spread that an insider had leaked information about storage locations. Trust became a rare commodity. Daniel started rotating staff, changing meeting places and using encrypted communication devices, but paranoia was spreading fast. The once smooth operation now felt unstable. Associates started disappearing, either arrested or fleeing abroad. The media began reporting vague stories about an unnamed drug network operating across northern England. Each headline made Daniel more anxious. He stopped attending public events and stayed mostly inside his estate, relying on coded messages to manage business. Lewis, on the other hand, continued his lavish lifestyle, convinced that their money could buy them out of any trouble. But behind the glamour and confidence, the noose was slowly tightening. The National Crime Agency was connecting every dot, every car purchase, property deal and phone record. What started as minor cracks in the empire had now become deep fractures, and it was only a matter of time before everything they had built began to collapse. The cracks in Daniel and Lewis's empire widened when betrayal entered their inner circle. Among their most trusted men was Jason Moore, a street-smart operator who had been with them since the early days. Jason managed key shipments and handled large sums of cash, making him one of the few people who truly understood how their network worked. For years his loyalty seemed unshakable. He lived comfortably off their generosity, driving expensive cars and managing a luxury apartment paid for by the empire. But when Jason was caught in a separate investigation involving illegal weapons, everything changed. Facing a long prison sentence, he decided to save himself. The police offered him a deal, full cooperation in exchange for reduced charges. Jason accepted without hesitation. At first, his betrayal went unnoticed. He continued to operate inside the network, attending meetings, transporting cash, and maintaining his role as if nothing had changed. But behind the scenes, he was feeding investigators critical information, warehouse locations, coded delivery routes, and even the times of incoming shipments. Every piece of information he shared helped law enforcement build a clearer picture of the empire's true scale. The National Crime Agency used his intelligence to launch a secret investigation they called Operation Granite. Their goal was to dismantle Daniel and Lewis's network entirely. For months, Operation Granite gathered evidence. Surveillance teams monitored houses, intercepted phone signals, and tracked vehicles linked to the group. Undercover agents blended into the nightlife scene to follow the flow of drugs and money. Hidden cameras were installed near warehouses, recording comings and goings at all hours. Each new discovery confirmed what Jason had told them. The empire wasn't just a local operation, it was one of the largest drug distribution systems in the UK. While the walls were closing in, Daniel started to sense that something was wrong. He noticed strange cars parked near one of his properties and began hearing rumors of police interest in their businesses. He ordered a security overhaul, destroying old phones and moving cash to new locations. But it was already too late. The investigation had gone too deep, and Jason had already handed over everything. Lewis, on the other hand, refused to believe they were under serious threat. He saw Daniel's paranoia as weakness and continued hosting parties and showing off his wealth. The difference between them had never been greater. Jason's betrayal became the turning point. He gave investigators the final piece they needed. A detailed description of a hidden warehouse in the outskirts of Liverpool used for drug storage and packaging. When authorities raided the location, they found nearly 100 kilograms of cocaine, weapons and financial ledgers. The evidence connected directly to Daniel and Lewis's fake companies. Operation Granite moved from investigation to action. Dozens of officers prepared for simultaneous raids across the country. Unaware that their fate had already been sealed, Daniel and Lewis carried on as usual. They believed they were still in control, still invisible. But their trusted ally had turned their empire into a trap. The countdown to their downfall had begun, and there was no way out. The morning their empire fell began like any other. Daniel was at his Cheshire mansion, enjoying his usual routine of coffee by the pool, while Lewis was in his London penthouse, planning a weekend getaway to Dubai. Neither of them realized that dozens of armed officers were already on their way, ready to execute one of the largest coordinated raids in British history. At exactly 5, the silence of dawn was shattered by the sound of helicopters hovering over rooftops and doors being smashed open across the country. Operation Granite had begun. Within minutes, police teams raided more than 20 properties connected to their network, from luxury homes to industrial warehouses. Daniel's arrest was swift. He tried to run upstairs to destroy his encrypted phone, but armed officers stormed the house before he could react. The mansion was filled with evidence, bags of cash, high-end watches, and a hidden room containing ledgers that detailed millions in drug transactions. Lewis, still half asleep in his penthouse, heard a loud crash as police burst through the door. He attempted to escape through a service corridor, but 2 officers were already waiting for him. In less than 10 minutes, both of the Empire's leaders were in custody. While the arrests made headlines, the true scale of what police uncovered was even more shocking. In a Liverpool warehouse labeled as a seafood import facility, investigators discovered over half a ton of high-grade cocaine hidden inside frozen containers. The drugs were valued at more than 70 million pounds, the very fortune that had built Daniel and Lewis's luxurious lifestyles. Alongside the narcotics, officers found weapons, bulletproof vests and fake passports, all proving the operation's sophistication. The news spread like wildfire. By the end of the day, every major media outlet in the UK was running the same story. 2 men behind £70 million drug empire arrested in nationwide raid. Footage of their luxury homes and confiscated cars filled television screens. Neighbors who once admired their success now watched in disbelief as police loaded evidence into vans. The lavish image that Daniel and Lewis had carefully built crumbled in a matter of hours. Inside the interrogation rooms, the reality of their situation began to sink in. The evidence was overwhelming. Documents, recordings, and financial records that tied them directly to every stage of the operation. The arrest of their associates only made things worse. One by one, members of their network began cooperating with the authorities in exchange for lighter sentences. Their world of loyalty and secrecy dissolved into fear and betrayal. For Daniel, the shock came not from being caught, but from realizing how deep the investigation had gone without his knowledge. For Lewis, it was the humiliation. He couldn't believe that the life he had flaunted so proudly had been stripped away in an instant. By nightfall, both men sat in separate cells, their empire gone, their freedom shattered. The empire that once ruled the streets of Manchester and beyond had been dismantled in a single day. A spectacular fall from luxury to captivity, marking the beginning of their long descent into the cold reality of prison life. The courtroom was packed with anticipation, as journalists, law enforcement officers, and curious onlookers gathered to witness the trial of 2 of the UK's most notorious drug lords. Daniel Ward and Lewis Carter, once untouchable and confident, now sat in prison-issue suits, their hands cuffed, staring ahead with expressions of disbelief and anger. The charges were severe: conspiracy to import and distribute Class A drugs, money laundering, possession of illegal firearms, and several counts of organized crime activity. For years, their empire had operated in the shadows, but now every detail was being exposed under the harsh lights of the courtroom. Prosecutors presented a meticulously constructed case. Financial records traced millions of pounds in transactions from shell companies to bank accounts across Europe. Encrypted messages were decrypted and displayed as evidence, revealing coded instructions for moving drugs and distributing payments. Video footage from hidden cameras showed couriers loading crates labeled as seafood into trucks, while images of luxury cars and yachts purchased with laundered money illustrated the depth of their wealth. The story of their rise from street hustlers to millionaires was laid bare for the public, removing the glamour they had once cultivated. Jason Moore, the lieutenant who had betrayed them, took the stand. His testimony was calm and precise, detailing how the shipments were managed, who oversaw distribution in different cities, and how the money was moved through layers of fake companies. Every word he spoke cut into the credibility of Daniel and Lewis. Witnesses from the National Crime Agency provided evidence of surveillance operations, tracking devices and recorded phone calls. The jury could see the empire from the inside, and it painted a picture of control, greed, and ruthless ambition. Daniel tried to maintain composure, taking notes and occasionally whispering to his lawyer. He understood the weight of the evidence, but he still held a glimmer of hope that something might go in his favor. Lewis, on the other hand, seemed unable to contain his frustration. His arrogance and habit of flaunting wealth had become a liability. Prosecutors repeatedly referenced social media posts that celebrated his extravagant lifestyle, emphasizing how their own carelessness contributed to their downfall. The defense attempted to argue that Daniel and Lewis were merely entrepreneurs, unaware of the full extent of illegal activity. They claimed some of the shipments had been handled by lower-level employees without the leader's knowledge. But the evidence was overwhelming. Emails, bank statements, and photographs tied both men directly to every major decision in the network. Even minor attempts to discredit witnesses failed under the weight of the documentation presented. Weeks of testimony culminated in a tense moment as the judge read the verdict. Both men were found guilty on all counts. The sentence was harsh but expected, 35 years in prison for each, with confiscation of their assets and lifetime restrictions on managing businesses. The courtroom fell silent as the gravity of their situation became undeniable. Their empire, once admired and feared, was now reduced to a cautionary tale. Outside the courthouse, media coverage exploded. Images of Daniel and Lewis being led away in handcuffs filled news broadcasts. Commentators discussed how arrogance, greed, and betrayal had led to their rapid downfall. Families of victims and communities impacted by the drugs expressed relief, while law enforcement celebrated a major victory. The trial had not only exposed the inner workings of one of the largest drug networks in the UK, but also demonstrated how no empire, no matter how well hidden, could escape the law indefinitely. In the cells that night, Daniel and Lewis faced a reality they had never imagined. The power they once wielded had vanished. Friends and associates turned into witnesses. Luxury and freedom had been replaced by cold concrete walls and iron bars. Their story had reached its most public chapter yet, and the consequences of their actions were impossible to escape. Every decision they had made, every risk they had taken, had led them to this point, a permanent fall from the heights of wealth and control to a life defined by confinement and regret. With Daniel and Lewis behind bars, the empire they had built so carefully began to crumble almost immediately. Their luxury homes were seized by authorities, some converted into government offices, others sold at auctions that drew curious onlookers eager to glimpse the remnants of their once glamorous lifestyle. Supercars that had turned heads on the streets of Manchester and London were confiscated and sold, fetching millions at private auctions. Nightclubs, bars, and shell companies that had served as fronts for laundering money were shut down, leaving thousands of employees uncertain about their livelihoods. The empire that had seemed untouchable just days earlier was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. Many of their associates faced arrests in the aftermath of the raids. Some had tried to distance themselves from the network in the hope of avoiding capture, but law enforcement's investigations were thorough. People who had once been loyal enforcers or trusted lieutenants were now behind bars, cooperating with authorities in exchange for lighter sentences. Informants revealed the full scale of the operation, exposing routes, methods, and hidden assets. What Daniel and Lewis had thought was loyalty had been nothing more than a fragile illusion, and the sudden exposure sent shockwaves throughout the criminal underworld. The media seized on every detail, chronicling the collapse of the empire with relentless intensity. Articles detailed the stolen wealth, the hidden drug warehouses, and the lifestyle of the men who had once flaunted their success. Television documentaries showed footage of confiscated cars and mansions, emphasizing the stark contrast between their previous opulence and the harsh reality of prison. Public fascination with the story was immense. People were captivated by the dramatic fall from power, a narrative that seemed almost cinematic in its scale and intensity. In prison, life was a brutal adjustment. Daniel attempted to appeal the verdict, clinging to hope that some legal loophole might reduce his sentence, but the overwhelming evidence made success impossible. He spent long hours analyzing law books, meeting with legal representatives, and strategizing, trying to regain a sense of control that had been stripped away. Lewis, in contrast, became increasingly withdrawn. Paranoia and anxiety overtook him as he struggled with the loss of freedom and power. The constant reminders of their previous life, the knowledge that people outside were living the luxury they had once owned, became a source of torment. Both men were forced to confront the consequences of their decisions, and for the first time, the magnitude of their failures weighed heavily on them. Communities once under the influence of their network began to experience change as well. With the key figures behind bars, rival gangs attempted to fill the power vacuum, but authorities maintained heightened surveillance to prevent further violence. Local residents felt a cautious sense of relief, as the daily threat of drug-related crime diminished. Yet the social impact of years of illegal activity could not be erased overnight. Families and neighborhoods bore the lasting scars of addiction, violence, and corruption. In retrospect, the downfall of Daniel and Lewis highlighted the fragility of criminal empires built on fear and greed. Their wealth, once celebrated and envied, became irrelevant in the face of the law. Every asset, relationship, and advantage they had relied on dissolved in an instant. The lesson was stark. No matter how powerful a criminal organization appears, the consequences of illegal actions are inescapable. The empire was gone, and with it, the illusion of untouchable supremacy, leaving only a story of ambition, betrayal, and the inevitable consequences of a life spent outside the law. Years after the arrest of Daniel Ward and Lewis Carter, their story had become one of the most infamous examples of ambition, greed, and the fleeting nature of criminal success. From the outside, it seemed as though their lives had been filled with endless luxury, mansion after mansion, sports cars, private jets, and nights spent in the most exclusive clubs. But the reality of their downfall served as a stark reminder that no empire built on crime could last. Prison walls replaced private estates, the roar of engines and music was replaced by silence and routine, and the freedom they once flaunted became an unreachable memory. The consequences of their actions were felt far beyond the prison walls. The neighborhoods they had once controlled experienced a temporary sense of relief. With the removal of the central figures in the network, drug supply routes were disrupted, and rival gangs were less able to exert the same level of influence. Law enforcement maintained an increased presence, and community programs worked to counteract the damage left behind. Yet the scars remained. Families affected by addiction, violence, and extortion struggled to rebuild, and the shadow of the empire lingered in the streets and homes of the communities they had exploited. Inside prison, Daniel and Lewis faced an existence that was both monotonous and unforgiving. Daniel threw himself into appeals and reading legal texts, desperately clinging to the hope of reducing his sentence. But the evidence against him was unassailable. Lewis, in contrast, sank deeper into a world of regret and paranoia, unable to cope with the loss of the lifestyle he had once flaunted so publicly. The contrast between them highlighted the personal consequences of their choices. One tried to fight for control in a system that would never bend, while the other succumbed to the psychological toll of defeat. Outside, their story continued to capture public imagination. Documentaries, news articles, and books chronicled their rise and fall, turning them into symbols of both the allure and the dangers of organized crime. Analysts and law enforcement officials often pointed to their mistakes, particularly their arrogance and public flaunting of wealth, as key reasons for their capture. Their story served as a lesson in a world governed by secrecy and calculated risk. Vanity could be more dangerous than any rival or law enforcement agency. Every Instagram post, flashy car, and public display of money had left traces that ultimately led to their undoing. The empire itself was gone, but the narrative it left behind continued to resonate. Daniel and Lewis had achieved everything they had dreamed of: wealth, status, and fear, but none of it lasted. Luxury had been replaced by confinement, power by helplessness, and admiration by contempt. Their fall was rapid, merciless, and absolute, leaving a clear message for anyone who might follow in their footsteps. Success built on crime is temporary, and every empire, no matter how grand, has a breaking point. In the end, the story of Daniel Ward and Lewis Carter was not just a tale of crime and punishment. It was a story about choices, consequences, and the fragile nature of power. Their journey from street-level hustlers to 70 million times drug lords, and finally to imprisoned figures, illustrated a timeless truth. Ambition without caution, greed without restraint, and success without integrity are paths that inevitably lead to ruin. The lessons of their rise and fall would echo for years, serving as both warning and fascination, a reminder that in the world of crime, no one is truly untouchable.